Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist for another edition of Friends and Enemies. It's the first edition of 2025. I've got a bit of a cold, if you excuse the voice. We're going to be discussing a number of developments over the holidays, the terrorist attacks in the United States on New Year's, the Russians' apparent intransigence in the negotiations over Ukraine, continued Russian war talk, the Trump administration's appointments, the Bilderberg Group's connection to the NATO leadership, and many other interesting side notes to try to understand exactly what the West is thinking, what Russia's doing, how the two sides are maneuvering. And of course, there's China in here, and of course, the fall of Syria, the fall of the Assad regime, and of course, the connection between Russia and various terrorist networks. The Russians, as we have said in previous episodes, control both sides of many conflicts. And in Syria, this is apparently the case. Russia's connection to recruiting for ISIS, Russia's hand behind some of the former Saddam Hussein Russian-trained intelligence people in ISIS, and some of the Islamists coming out of Russia, because Russia has Islamists, who appear to have had connections to the intelligence services going back to Soviet times, are all indications. We are not done with the Great Terror. We're not done with Islamists attacking the West. And of course, Germany has been in a heightened state of alert. The United States is now too. We've also got biological threats possibly emerging out of China again. You've got COVID restrictions being adopted by some American hospitals already. Of course, we're in the flu season, and they're saying it's a more virulent flu season than normal. We've also got the very cold winter here. And I think also in Europe, the temperatures are going to be dropping. We've got a polar vortex coming. Is it the beginning of the grand solar minimum we've talked about before? So my co-host, Alex Benesch, is in Germany. I'm in the United States. I'm Jeff Nyquist. And Alex, what is this about the General Secretary of NATO and his relationship with the Bilderberg Group and how they're trying to mobilize that group in support of the NATO agenda?
Well, I was surprised to find, this was like 1 or 2 weeks ago, to find a story on the London Guardian website, and this was about Bilderberg. Now, normally, they allow basically at the Guardian one story about Bilderberg per year. Now, this is always written by Charlie Skelton. So every time there's this big Bilderberg conference, it's in a different country every year. They always rent a 5-star luxurious hotel, and you're not supposed to really know what they're talking about. They give out some talking points on their website, and so I was surprised to see that that there was a Bilderberg story on The Guardian, even though this is not the time when they usually have their conference. Now, many people have heard about Bilderberg now, but this is sort of a transatlantic organization, very traditional. It's been around for many decades, and it's been tied to the Cold War. From the few statements that we've heard from Bilderberg members, they portray themselves as the protectors, right? They network between America and Europe, and they make sure that business is functioning and that security is functioning. And they have to do that in secret, because reasons, classified stuff is being talked about. So you go to the Guardian website, and it's a story by Charlie Skelton, whom I've met briefly at one of those conferences. I think it was in Watford in Britain. And he talks about the new era of Bilderberg. Now with the incoming Trump administration, there seems to be a new openness to Bilderberg. Now they want to promote themselves more in public, tell people not to worry, when this bigger war is coming, when everything's escalating, Bilderberg is there representing all these different corporations and governments and agencies, Bilderberg will protect us. Everything's going to be fine. And we should trust Bilderberg because they've protected us during the Cold War. That seems to be the self-marketing here. And now they've recruited the former NATO Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg. And that's an odd choice. Not so much because he's an important guy. They have important guys all the time, every year in those conferences. But if you do it like this, at a time like this, it draws attention to Bilderberg, which is kind of a new thing. They want a certain amount of attention. They could have picked some standard bureaucrat, some Euro person that nobody really knows. But now they've picked a person who is known internationally. Now, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, he apparently didn't like his work so much, or his job so much at NATO. He talked about switching jobs to the, I think, Norwegian Central Bank or some or the other. But now he is in his position at Bilderberg, right? So now we had not just this piece in The Guardian by Mr. Skelton, who is kind of skeptic. He's alternating between pragmatism and skepticism, right? I think he seems to be like a bit on the left, and he understands the pragmatic realities, but he's also suspicious of Bilderberg because they're so powerful and seem so right-wing, okay? Next was Bloomberg. Bloomberg puts out a story almost at the same time about Bilderberg, right? And then the Financial Times published something in September. This was an obituary for Viktor Halberstadt. Well, you probably don't know him because that's how Bilderberg used to roll. They use these guys that nobody knows. And Mr. Viktor Halberstadt, he was always at these conferences for, half of his life. And they talk about, in the Financial Times, how great he was. And they say he's from a Jewish family. He's from Amsterdam. And he was hidden from the Nazis, so he survived the Nazi era. And later he found out that a young Henry Kissinger was stationed very closely to where he was hidden, because Henry Kissinger was with the U.S. military when he was young. And so later in life, those two meet again. Henry Kissinger, for as long as we could think of, the man at Bilderberg, and then you got Viktor Halberstadt. So this is kind of the framing from the Financial Times. They're saying, look, there was fascism, the threat of fascism, and then you had all these guys who later met at Bilderberg, and these guys fought fascism, right? So Bilderberg is fighting fascism. But Bilderberg was also fighting the communists, they say. Isn't that great, right? So they fight both fascists and communists, so you shouldn't be worrying at all. They got this all handled. They have a new degree of publicity, but there's still a massive amount of problem. I suggest people, if you haven't seen it, check out the episode we did on Henry Kissinger and his ties to Soviet circles and how he made so many choices that benefited the USSR, and also how Henry Kissinger finally sold the big lie, the big deception to President Nixon. We talk about that at length in that previous episode, telling Nixon, hey, this is the moment, there's so much friction, which is fake, but there's so much friction between the Russians and the Chinese. We have to use that. We have to play nice with the Chinese as a counterweight to the Russians. And there was a decade of deception before that, and finally Henry Kissinger sold the lie. So, in essence, Bilderberg is now presenting itself more publicly as our savior, kind of an elite parliament of different people, right-wingers, not so right-wingers, some left-wingers. They want to protect us from fascism, like Putin's Russia today, and they want to protect us from communists, like China. Sounds nice, but what about the espionage problem that's been so bad all throughout the Cold War, and even after the Cold War, It's never been properly addressed. It's never been properly solved, and the clock is ticking. Now we're about 5 years away, according to NATO's own estimates, about 5 years away from a major global war, and we can't trust these people at Bilderberg. And I don't think the incoming Trump administration is trusting these people that much. So it will be interesting to see where this is going in the next couple of months.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder if you could explain to us what the Bilderberg Group actually is, because people have created a huge, mysterious conspiracy theory when, in reality, of course, people at the elite level, corporate executives, government ministers, influential people, have always been getting together, have always been trying to figure out to solve problems together. And your mentioning of Kissinger, these are the primary capitalist groups that are going to be infiltrated, right? They're going to be infiltrated by, sorry, I had turned my phone off and it popped back on again. They're going to be infiltrated by these folks. And one of the things I want to say, because most people don't view things sociologically or in terms of a way of seeing larger social interactions, whether it's a small group in your neighborhood or it's these elite groups. People get together, they talk, they communicate, they coordinate, they bicker, they disagree, they agree. What we had when World War II ended, we had a lot of people, they just don't understand this. The Axis was defeated. Nazi Germany, Japan, Italy, their allies, they were all defeated by the United Nations, which was all the other countries united against the Axis. And the Soviet Union, the communists, were a major component in this war especially against Germany, but also against Japan towards the end. And what people don't realize is that when the West had a lot of these false notions that we were going to get along with Russia after, that communism wasn't going to be a problem, that Stalin had renounced spreading the revolution, because he did. In 1943, the Comintern was shut down. Of course, it was falsely shut down. It was sort of a false folding up the tent of communism and saying, we're not going to do this to you anymore because you're our buddies now. They realized one was really against the West. And so all of these capitalists, all of these government officials in all these countries, these Western countries, and in America especially, they thought, what are we going to do? And so what they did was something called containment, that Secretary of State Dean Acheson and President Truman had sort of set as a policy. And that was the strategic policy of the United States on containment, which contained communism to the Soviet Union's immediate satellite states. Now, that policy was a dreadful failure. And the mentality that produced it is the mentality of the capitalists. Why? Because politicians are very sensitive to capitalists. Capitalists want to trade. They want to make money. They want to move money all around the world. They want to invest. They want to trade. They want to have access to resources at a cheap, to buy cheap and to sell dear. This is what and it's good. It makes the world economically work. But the problem is having this show is called Friends and Enemies. When you have an enemy, the problem that you have is that he knows you're a capitalist. He knows you want to make a deal. And so he's looking at you like he can be mean to you, and then he can hold out a bait that he's going to be nice to you, and he can sucker you over and over again. And so containment had this feature that they were always breaking the containment. So that in the 1950s, you have Cuba going communist, and the United States didn't react. You have the 1960s, where Laos went communist, where then in the 1970s, Vietnam Cambodia and Angola, and then in the late 70s you got Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You had this breakout, especially in Africa and even in Latin America. The communists just kept advancing. Containment was leaky. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in '79. It was a containment didn't work, and they finally, I think, in a way, Reagan got elected, and he said rollback, not containment, and this seemed to be successful. Only the Soviets then came out with perestroika and super love and kissy and bear hug will be your buddies again. The super peace offensive of Gorbachev, who won Reagan over. So that Reagan accepted the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, which a lot of hardcore anti-communists in the U.S. thought, what is Reagan doing? This is wrong. And then everybody, the whole conservative anti-communist movement in the United States, with William Buckley ostensibly at the head of it, accepted the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe as a real event and just vilified people like Galitzin and Angleton, who'd said, this is coming. It's going to be a facade. It's going to be false. It's a super peace offensive. Don't believe it. And so we went into this situation we have here. So here we have a new Cold War. Well, I don't think the Cold War ever stopped. Here we have a new Cold War, and the problem that we have, it's endemic, is these people pop out like a mad jack in the box again, and they've got the same mentality. They're thinking containment, because nobody's talking about rolling back the Russians in Ukraine.
Well, it's like there's a whole bunch of organizations like Bilderberg, and they all kind of work together. So Bilderberg, as a transatlantic organization, there's so many more. There's like the Atlantic Bridge in Germany, and its members, they've become really powerful. There's all kinds of transatlantic ties going on. But if it's nice to have, it's nice to have an organization like NATO or Bilderberg, as long as you can trust these people, as long as there's proper counterintelligence, and that's what's been missing for so long. Now,
so wait a minute. Let's clarify what you just said. Do you mean that they're infiltrated and we don't know which one of them, like a Klaus Schwab, for example, is an agent of Russia and or China?
I mean, you got these old schoolers like Henry Kissinger, right? So people associated Henry Kissinger with Bilderberg, and they associated the old Mr. Rockefeller with Bilderberg. Now, one Henry Kissinger, who's infiltrated Bilderberg, can pull in new people and create this next generation of Bilderberg members and get them to different places. Now, this is sort of like, if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be doing this at all, right? It's like you're setting up these meetings, you're talking about very sensitive stuff, but you don't really understand who is who. And now that we're learning more about Bilderberg and the details of the past, especially the Cold War, there's been an insane level of distrust. And there's some just staggering ties of Bilderberg members and their circles.
Well, let's talk about Stoltenberg's past. What is Stoltenberg's ideology? You're German, he's Norwegian. You probably know what he is politically, right?
Well, I mean, the guy. Admittedly, the guy was in his youth. He was a leftist. He was singing songs against NATO, and his sister, I think, was also pretty active in those movements. And they thought it was fun. It was fun and exciting to them. He said he even joked about it, his own past. And
so how does he have an opinion that NATO's good? I mean, where did he write an autobiography saying how he understood that? I mean, why should we trust somebody with that background? It's like, I was a devil worshiper when I was 20, and now I'm, but now I'm sort of against it, but I don't have any religion, I never had a conversion away from it. I mean, how do you explain it?
Yeah, it's kind of this weird nexus going on over here. It's like, weird people, weird bureaucrats, people you normally never even hear about, and they have so much power. There's no proper counterintelligence here. And then this sort of nexus from Europe, that's then connected to America. And there's supposed to be this transatlantic cooperation going on. But if we look at some of these, guys, there's communist ties. Some of these Bilderberg, especially early Bilderberg members, they even had Nazi ties. I mean, serious Nazi ties.
And by the way, that's problematic because the Nazi party, toward the end of World War II, was heavily infiltrated by Soviet agents.
Yeah.
Because many of them thought the Red Army was going to get all of Germany, maybe. And, in 1943, it didn't look like the Allies were capable of landing on the continent. Nobody had conducted mass amphibious operations with major armies before. And so people thought, gosh, when the Red Army gets here, I'm going to be hung. I better enough to be a Soviet agent. These Nazis who were in this group to war were really working for Moscow.
Yeah, it's present some examples of this craziness. So, as you mentioned, Jens Stoltenberg and the Norwegians, right? The new guy at NATO, Mr. Rutte, he's from Holland, and most people have never even heard of the guy. And he's like this person that nobody really knows. I mean, people were surprised to find that he's the new Secretary General of NATO. The press try to find family members and friends and acquaintances to interview, so they have something to write about who Mr. Rutte is. Turns out, no friends, nobody wants to talk, nobody seems to know the guy. He's just smiling all the time. And this is kind of this huge maniacal problem here in Europe. And Bilderberg sort of makes this European problem America's problem. Now, here's so going back to that Financial Times piece a few weeks ago or months ago in September, they talk about Viktor Halberstadt, who was always at these Bilderberg conferences. And he's from a Jewish family, and they survived the Nazis and blah, 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 blah. Later at Bilderberg, he meets Henry Kissinger, who was stationed in Germany with the U.S. Army. Sounds great, right? Bilderberg saving us from the fascists.
Sergeant Henry Kissinger, by the way.
What?
He was Sergeant Henry Kissinger back in the day.
Yeah. But
he had a lot of power. He was actually running like he was effectively the mayor of a German town.
Yeah. And sort of this interesting, nice-sounding framing from the Financial Times that these people are saving us from the fascists and the communists. But now, it's more complicated than that. Mr. Halberstadt, he had been working for the Crown of the Netherlands and the government of the Netherlands. It's this tiny little country, very weird country. And also, the Queen of the Netherlands, Queen Beatrix, for a long time was attending these Bilderberg conferences. Okay, new NATO Secretary General Mr. Rutte is also from Holland. Now, the Crown of the Netherlands, the Crown of the Netherlands are basically Germans. They're from the dynasties Oranien, Nassau, Mecklenburg, and Lippe. Now, we know about Prince Bernhard and his membership in the NSDAP party. Now, Prince Bernhard, he's kind of a link between the Netherlands and Germany. He was a member of the NSDAP. And it took until the 1990s.
Which is the Nazi, for those who don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, the Nazi party. So it took until the 1990s when a copy of his Nazi party membership ID card, when a copy was found in the United States. Now, this copy was in a safe of an American official. I don't know exactly why this copy ended up with an American official, but that's when we had the final confirmation that Prince Bernhard, who was also tied to Bilderberg, that Prince Bernhard was indeed a member of the Nazi party, the NSDAP. So he was always, Prince Bernhard always tried to deny his membership. And we also know that the high nobility was just flooding into the Nazi party, taking on various positions. And then we had some other people from the Netherlands, noblemen, Sir Henry Deterding. He was from the Shell Corporation, now the Royal Dutch Shell, which is also a company that's tied to the nobility. And so Mr. Deterding was giving a lot of money to the Nazi party. There's a good book out there. It's from Glyn Roberts. It's called The Most Powerful Man in the World. Mr. Deterding was funding Hitler as early as 1921, which is kind of amazing.
That's awfully early.
Yeah, it's extremely early. And so this book, The Most Powerful Man in the World, kind of reconstructs how much money this guy funneled to the Nazis when the Nazis really needed that money. And so Mr. Deterding also bought some oil fields in the US. He also got into the Russian market. He had his partner from British military intelligence, George MacDonogh, who was tied to the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Now, the Royal Institute of International Affairs sort of is like a predecessor to Bilderberg, and it's also tied to the Council on Foreign Relations as well. So these are not really, as people claim on the internet, these are not really left-wing organizations at all. They use left-wing policy, or they support left-wing policy sometimes, but it's more complicated than that. So this is just one example of influential Bilderberg people tied to the Nazis. You know, the Crown of the Netherlands, Queen, the family of Queen Beatrix, and these sort of people. And then here's another thing. This was also from the Financial Times piece in September. So they talk about Viktor Halberstadt's first Bilderberg conference, first time he ever attended. He was a professor in economics at the University of Leiden. And in 1975, he was invited to Bilderberg for the first time. And there he met Margaret Thatcher. When was she Prime Minister of Britain? Wasn't this later?
From, I think, around 1979 to the early 90s.
Yeah, so he met Margaret Thatcher, and he met Donald Rumsfeld. And so the Financial Times,
an interesting character too, yeah.
And so the Financial Times is giving us an interesting anecdote here. So a man called Joseph Luns, who was the Secretary General of NATO at the time. Probably nobody remembers this guy. So Joseph Luns is telling Mr. Halberstadt to come over. Hey, I want to talk to you. We have a group here. We want to talk to you. And in this group was also Dennis Healy, the British, what do they call it in English? The financial minister, some sort.
Secretary of the Exchequer.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's what they call it.
Or Minister of the Exchequer, yeah.
So now you got Mr. Halberstadt, who is his first Bilderberg conference. You have Joseph Luns, who is Secretary General of NATO. And you have Dennis Healy, this creepy Brit. And then they wave at Margaret Thatcher and tell her, come over. We want to talk to you. We got a great little group going on here. Miss Thatcher, come over. But Thatcher wouldn't come over because she knew that Mr. Healy was a real communist, right? And so the Financial Times is giving us this little bit of inside anecdote of this Bilderberg conference in 1975. Now, why does the Financial Times do this? My suspicion is they want to create the impression that a variety of ideologies is represented at Bilderberg. So you got super left, you got what they call social democrat like Halberstadt, you get a right-winger pro-business person like Margaret Thatcher, and you get Joseph Luns, Secretary General of NATO. So it almost sounds like Bilderberg is sort of this secret little, very powerful parliament with different opinions, right? But there's some stuff that the Financial Times is leaving out of the story. They're not mentioning this, even though it's really important for the reader. Mr. Joseph Luns. Mr. Joseph Luns was a member in 1933, a member of the National Socialist Movement in the Netherlands. It's sort of like the Nazis of the Netherlands, you could call it. They call it the NSB. And later he claimed that was just, he was young and he was dumb, and this was just, people should forget about that. And he was in a fascist party. He had a great career in the diplomatic service and espionage. And Mr. Luns then married the Baroness Leah van Heemstra, a niece of Baroness Ella van Heemstra. Now, Ella, why am I mentioning Ella van Heemstra? Because she was one of the earliest supporters of Adolf Hitler, and she was praising him in public. She personally met Adolf Hitler in 1935 and published some stories in a British fascist newspaper, calling Hitler a charming personality. She had a photo from that day. I think it was like a modern day selfie, right? With her and Hitler. Right. I guess. Right. She had that image, that picture, in her office. And so and this Baroness from the Netherlands, she was also kind of connected to some other Nazi officers. Now, of course, later they claimed this was just, the early mistakes, and then they changed course and all that, and then, they all supposedly changed. But it's always the question with these people, and we talked about Louis Mountbatten before and all that. So if you had been in bed with the Nazis, what do the communists know about that? What do the Russians know about your secret history?
And what is your moral compass that you were with the Nazis? Is that moral compass so broken that your reliability as someone supporting freedom in the Western values is really shaky?
Yeah. And it's like it just, there's no end to the madness here. So this Dennis Healy guy that was at that Bilderberg meeting in 1975 in that little group, with Joseph Luns and this little group wanted to talk to Margaret Thatcher, but she wouldn't talk to them. This Dennis Healy, he was really a communist, and he was recruited for the British government by Prime Minister Harold Wilson. And we've talked about Harold Wilson before.
Harold Wilson was accused of being a Soviet agent by the deputy director of MI5. And it was part of the spy catcher scandal.
Yeah.
And of course, he also, the head of MI5 was accused of being a Soviet agent, Sir Roger Hollis. And of course, the book Spycatcher was banned in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. You'd have to go to America to get a copy of Spycatcher.
Yeah.
So the infiltration of the West, when people come out from the intelligence services to write a Kiss and Tell book, it just spills all out that you've got communists crawling in all the high places.
Yeah. So imagine the situation. You're Margaret Thatcher. You're at a Bilderberg conference, this transatlantic, secretive meeting to protect the world and protect business interests of the West. And it's supposed to be a group of trusted persons, selected people, right? Background checked, and just where you can speak more openly, because that's kind of the marketing so far of Bilderberg. This is when they can speak freely. This is not like in public when everything has to be written by these, speechwriters, and everything has to be triple checked, and you can barely say anything, and this is like, in public everything is complicated. But at Bilderberg you can talk freely. But here she was, Margaret Thatcher, in 1975, at Bilderberg with these communists running around, and they want to talk to her, and she said no. Like, why would I give my personal opinion on things to Dennis Healy, right? I mean, Dennis Healy, who worked for Harold Wilson, I mean, even the CIA had to intervene. The CIA came to the Brits and said, you have a real problem with Mr. Wilson and others, and there's defectors, confirming what we could confirm otherwise as well. What's going on? But, this was the reality. This was the reality of Bilderberg. Now, Prime Minister Wilson, he had a private secretary called Marcia Williams, the Baroness Falkender. They traveled to the USSR multiple times. They had business dealings with the USSR. And the MI5, some of the British intelligence service MI5, they actually collaborated with the CIA under James Angleton. And they looked into the possibility that Prime Minister Wilson's predecessor, Mr. Gateskill, was murdered by Soviet intelligence to get him out of the way, so the road is free for Wilson.
Yeah, that came from Golitsyn, by the way. Golitsyn had defected in December of 1961. And Golitsyn told, when he was debriefed by the CIA, he said, the Soviet Union is planning an assassination of a major figure of a party leader in Western Europe. They're going to kill the party leader so that their man, who's number 2 in the party, will go to the top position. And shortly thereafter, Hugh Gaitskell, who was the head of the British Labour Party, had tea and crumpets at the Soviet embassy. He then comes down with lupus, which is an autoimmune disease, which was so severe, his lupus was so severe it killed him. And of course, they couldn't figure out, so Peter Wright, who wrote Spycatcher, deputy director of MI5, was told this by the Americans. Look, we've got information that Gateskill might have been murdered. And when he looked at it, he said, oh my gosh, he eats at the Soviet embassy, he dies.
Yeah.
It has business connections in Eastern Europe with communist companies,
and it's not like
he travels there all the time. Yeah,
and it's not like just the Americans were outraged. It's not just Angleton who was outraged. It was people at the MI5. It was all kinds of conservatives in Britain, and it got so bad that powerful conservatives in Britain, they actually tried to get a group together and involve the British Crown to sort of intervene and get rid of these this labor government, right? So that's how bad it was. But the problem was this conservative group, they approached Lord Louis Mountbatten because he was seen as somebody who could help them. But somehow this whole thing leaked to the press, and of course that was then the big scandal. The scandal was on, and the press had a field day, and they said, there's nothing there. It's just a right-wing ploy to smear labor and just to interfere in politics. No, this was a real spy thriller, and people can check out some older shows that we did on Lord Louis Mountbatten and his communist wife Edwina.
There's a book on this by Chapman Pincher called Treason, which goes into Sir Roger Hollis and the background of all these events. And it's the research, and he's not the only one. The research done on this, on the fact that British intelligence at the highest level, and MI5 is their counterintelligence. It's to defend Britain. It's like the British FBI, only it's more in its powers than the American FBI. This was this Spycatcher scandal. When this all came out, of course, people said, "Oh, those right-wing nuts! They believe this sort of, communists under the bed." And the problem is, there were communists under the bed, and the researchers that came along later found all kinds of clues and evidence Sir Roger Hollis. Um, in fact, there was a William West was another British researcher who wrote a very excellent book on the background of Sir Roger Hollis, showing how he was recruited by the communists, how he helped the communists during the war, because he was supposed to be watching during the war, during World War II.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's if people want to get into this literature, go look it up. It's vast, and the digging that some very excellent journalists did is incredible. And yet this literature is neglected today.
Yeah.
And we've got so many of these people, like you say, Eastern elite. People say, oh, the Western elite is evil Russia. We should ally with Putin against him. When these people in the Western elite are really agents of Moscow to begin with. So Moscow's now going to save us from its agents that it's planted in our elite.
Yeah. So
See
now
how
we have
crazy it gets?
Yeah, so now we have the new generation of not just Bilderberg, but also the new corporations represented at Bilderberg. A lot of them, and I'll get to that in a minute, a lot of them are tied to defense, are tied to technology, military technology or surveillance technology. So you got all these new corporations at Bilderberg, new members at Bilderberg. But the espionage problem has never really been properly addressed. It's never been solved. So how much secrets are spilled now? And I mean, I always said that at a Bilderberg conference per se, I don't expect them to get into the most sensitive information directly, right? Because of the logistics. Now imagine you have a huge 5-star hotel. It's a different one every year, right? Sometimes it's in the US, and most of the time it's in Europe. It's far away from America, usually. And it's these structures are vast, right? Huge hotels. How do you sweep for bugs in time before the conference begins in a place like this? Now, technology has improved. You now have these bug finders, these bug scanners. They shoot microwaves at surfaces, and if there's any
Windows.
yeah,
Windows surfaces.
and if there's
You can pick up you can
oh yeah,
yeah, you can be parked far away, aim the beam at a window, and you can hear conversations in that room.
yeah, and also, I mean, even if you have one of those new scanners and you blast every surface, right? With microwave energy, and you get a reaction from electronic components, even when they're not transmitting. So in the past, you would listen on frequencies and you would look if something is transmitting that shouldn't be transmitting. But nowadays, bugs are smaller, bugs are better, bugs can be really planted deep inside of a physical structure. I mean, maybe people remember some of these bug planting in American embassies. Soviet bugs, they were so deeply embedded, you had to tear down the whole building and start over. So how would you even sweep a 5-star hotel, a complete hotel, every plant, every potted plant, every surface, every table, every wall, everything? How do you do that in time? You can't. And that's why I think people don't really talk about the most sensitive stuff at Bilderberg, but it's still very, very important. And it's not the only place and time when these people meet. So espionage is a huge problem. Now, when I read that recent piece by British journalist Charlie Skelton in The Guardian, now he is kind of suspicious. I mean, Skelton understands the threat by the Russians and apparently in the threat by the Chinese, but Skelton is really skeptical when it comes to defense corporations, defense companies. So he's kind of jabbing in his article, jabbing at these defense companies represented at Bilderberg.
This always bothers me when people are against the actual companies that are going to make the weapons to defend them. Yeah. This is always troubling to me. It's like, they're evil. They're making weapons. It's like, they're making weapons to defend you. And I want to introduce this is a book written by Greg Autry and Peter Navarro. I had the privilege of meeting Greg Autry in October in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And in this book, he has an interesting statistic that during the 1960s, the United States spent the equivalent of $7 trillion in today's money to build the rocket forces and the strategic bombers and the boomers to have deterrence against the Soviet Union. And of course, structure for all those rockets, for the building of all those weapons to defend us, those high-end strategic weapons, strike weapons. That infrastructure was basically torn down and rotted away after the so-called fall of the Soviet Union. And with all of the Democrats being set against it under the Bush administration, they wanted to start rebuilding that under George W. Bush. They finally got a commitment from Congress, $1.2 trillion to rebuild this infrastructure that really cost $1 trillion. This is why we don't have any new land-based missiles, accurate, hard-hitting strategic weapon that's the most difficult to shoot down. We replaced it. Our Minutemen, probably half of them don't work. And so we're literally, our strategic deterrent is rotting away because we won't commit the $7 trillion. And these other European countries want to spend less of their GDP than the U.S., even though Europe has more resources than the U.S. has, and the U.S. is having this trouble. So people don't understand. We don't have the mentality to commit the resources to actually defend ourselves. And the Russians and Chinese, no matter how bungling, no matter how they're serious their economic problems, they've committed the resources. They're building the rockets. They're building the nuclear warheads. And they're building these new classes of weapons, not just road mobile, which we don't even have, ICBMs and IRBMs, but they're building the hypersonic missiles. And they've got the long-range cruise missiles that can't be shot down. And so this is what really is scary. We're still not doing anything. Now, this Bilderberg meeting, do you think they're going to talk about actually ponying up the money?
Well, this has been the biggest problem of Bilderberg, I think, especially when we look at the Cold War history. Quite a few corporations associated with Bilderberg and represented at Bilderberg. You know, even German corporations, I think, like Siemens and others. They've traded with the East quite significantly, and this of course became a bigger issue thanks to Henry Kissinger when he convinced President Nixon to change tactics with the Chinese. Right, when all throughout the 1960s there was this big theater that was played by the Russians and the Chinese. They acted like they hated each other. They created these border incidents where they were shooting at each other a bit. And they created this impression they were about to go to war. And not only did they stage some border shootings, they also flooded their own communist high-ranking official circles, flooded it with this disinformation. The Russians saying we hate the Chinese saying we hate the Russians, we want to go to war. And this disinformation found its way to the West, different ways.
And out popped Henry Kissinger with the ideas, we'll go to China, we'll open China, we'll build up China as a counterweight to Russia.
Exactly.
And look at how this has turned out.
And Kissinger could always say, well, the intelligence supports it. The intelligence from different, areas, the intelligence is saying these communist countries hate each other.
Chinese they fed that Chinese, they fed that intelligence.
And we talked about
it was so persuasive to people who wanted to believe it.
And we talked about this finale, really. I think it was in '69 or something. This grand finale of these theatrics from the Russians and the Chinese, when there was a fake coup d'état attempt in China. And it sounded really dramatic, and they really played it up. And this was the moment, basically, when Kissinger could convince Nixon to change course. And of course, when the president of the United States is influenced by this and gives out the new policy, it trickles down. Suddenly, all these companies, corporations represented at Bilderberg, they're now encouraged, more or less, to trade with China, to buy and sell, or to sell technology to China, right? So it's not like every corporation or every corporation represented at Bilderberg is knowingly part of some conspiracy. It's more like, well, this is the new policy. This is what Nixon could say and others could say, Kissinger could say. This is what the intelligence is suggesting to us. It's like this old argument by Kissinger that this is kind of a new version of the old Metternich system of balancing the powers and maintaining the peace, blah, blah, blah. So
he was very good at pulling out the Metternich thing and trying to snow people with that.
So this is why Bilderberg really was dangerous, because it creates the impression for these members that they all know what they're doing, and they've weighed the options, they've looked at the intelligence, and they're managing the peace. And now we got some new members, and this was in the Charlie Skelton piece on The Guardian. Or some of them are not that new, but they have new companies now. So it talks about the former Google boss Eric Schmidt. He's now involved in the National Security Commission.
Google is bad, man.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with Google.
Everybody
know that.
He's now involved. Yeah, he's now involved in the National Security Commission for AI, and he is busy building a drone company. A drone company aimed at the Ukrainian market. And then they talk about the Swedish industrialist by the name of Marcus Wallenberg. It's a very old family over there. He's heading the defense company Saab. They used to make cars. People still remember those.
My dad drove a Saab, yes.
So
they also make aircraft. They've also made fighter planes for Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. And so this company Saab is now gaining momentum because of the war between, or the Russia's war against Ukraine. So Saab is making more things. Then Skelton talks about Peter Thiel, who is somewhat close to the Donald Trump camp. Now Thiel has various corporations. One of them is called Anduril. I think that's another Lord of the Rings name that he picked. Of course, he has the company called Palantir, which is sort of machine learning for security purposes to find out where the enemy is, when he's there, what he's doing, what he's going to do next. Now Peter Thiel's trusted right-hand man, you could say, Alex Karp, who's heading Palantir. He's now in the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group, and Mr. Karp says his company is responsible for most of the attacks of Ukrainian forces against the Russians. And he recently said to the New York Times that pretty soon, there will be a multi-front war of the West with China, Russia, and Iran. Okay, so all this stuff is mentioned in the piece by Charlie Skelton in The Guardian, and he's not giving his own interpretation of it. He's not saying, I find it scary because, defense companies, but he's not really giving us a lot of context here. So he's not really saying if it's done right, it's a great thing. He's not really talking about the espionage and that sort of stuff. If a left-wing person who tends to read The Guardian, if a left-wing reader of The Guardian reads this piece, the reader is sort of left with the impression that, well, it's kind of scary, Bilderberg and these defense companies and talk of war. And, man, I hope that, there's some other guys at Bilderberg who could counteract these right-wingers, you could say, are these defense companies. And this brings us back to these weirdos at Bilderberg, these left-wingers, or these people who try to play nice with Russia or play nice with China, as we've seen for so long by Henry Kissinger and others, right? And there's also some talk about the incoming Trump administration too. So there's another reference. Oh, maybe Bilderberg is turning right wing because of Trump. That's
yeah. Let me make a strategic comment on this, and it has to do with something that Lenin talked about, that all of his followers talk about: the correlation of forces. This book here, this was the master text, Soviet military strategy. This is the Rand Corporation translation of it here. There's two major translations. This one I like in particular. It's edited by Marshal V.D. Sokolovsky, who was the great Soviet strategist, military strategist. He was on the committee that reworked Soviet strategy in the late 1950s, together with KGB, that wanted to do this long-range deception, this super peace offensive, this collapse of communism strategy, which was a mimicking of Lenin's 1920s Operation Trust and NEP, New Economic Policy Strategy, where the Soviet Union, after the Russian Civil War, at the very beginning of the Soviet Union, tried to convince the West that it was no longer communist. That was under Lenin in the 1920s. That lasted to the late 1920s. Stalin then started to collectivize agriculture, which he first started the first experiments in Siberia for doing that. But this book is important because you're talking about this problem in the West that we can't get our act together to raise our force structures to be able to match the Russians and Chinese, who are now combined against the West and still have infiltrated the West, have deals with Western corporations and governments, like we know they're all over Germany, they're all over France, they're all over Canada, they're in the United States, they're all over Latin America. And what he talks about is how, in the midst of this kind of situation where the correlation of forces have moved in favor of the socialist camp, how you start a rocket war as the thing to finally topple the West. And of course, it's always the West's resistance against socialism is regarded as an aggressive, hostile, just the West resisting, like in Ukraine, is regarded as something that warrants possible nuclear measures. And this is what the Russian government's talking about now. And they say that it's the nuclear, in this thing, it's the nuclear rocket weapon is the decisive weapon of this future war, where they can just devastate the West. And if they've made adequate preparations in Russia, they won't just merely survive, they'll thrive, they'll take over Europe, and they'll be able to divide the world with the other communist countries. And of course, what they call the socialist camp. And what's really interesting, there's another book called, which is very interesting. It's kind of a sleeper. The People, the Army, the Commander, written by Colonel Skirdo, who was a teacher of a defector I knew, Colonel Stanislav Lunev. And I discussed this book with Lunev and what he thought. But the little secret nugget in this book is about a future invasion of a very large Western country, which, of course, guess who that is? That's the United States. And he's saying in this book, this is a very difficult operation, which could lose millions of men because of partisan warfare. And it's very interesting. There is a part. This is a book by where did I put it? I wanted a quote from. It's a book that Joseph D. Douglas Jr. and now it's just disappeared. Here it is. This is a quote. This is so fascinating because they developed this strategy of deception that the KGB was going to carry out about future liberalization. And here, this is Soviet Strategy for Nuclear War by Joseph D. Douglas, a friend of mine, and co-authored with Amaretta Huber. And this book says, second and subsequent periods of the war, talking about after you nuke the United States, what do you do? Which is what Skirdo is on about. What is the role of nukes? You don't, not that you devastate everything so it's a nuclear desert. You do it in such a way that you can actually take over countries. And this passage is key. Following the initial period are the second and subsequent periods of the war. These are the period in which the longer-term goals of the war would be realized after the nuclear battle itself has been won or at least determined. These periods of the war appear to have received a great deal of attention following the conclusion of the mid-1960s that it might well be possible to knock out of the war in one blow the nation that had considerable depth at its disposal and was prepared. That's the United States. We believe that aspects of planning for these periods are better examined as part of the entire strategic planning effort. This effort was going on into the 1970s. This is when Skirdo's work came out. Like, what do we do with the United States after we have gained strategic nuclear supremacy, when we've knocked out all of the U.S. nuclear weapons and industries, so the United States is helpless? How do we finish it off? How do we complete the task? And of course, it's all about what develops later as China's role. This was the testimony of Colonel Stanislav Lunev, saying that China was going to take over the lower 48 states, was going to invade, provide the troops, and that Russia would take over Canada and parts of Alaska. And so if you go through this literature bit by bit, what you find is all these pieces connect, and they form a whole picture of this step-by-step strategic planning, strategic deception, preparation for war. And we see it today in what Russia and China are doing, and the use of Islamic terror by them as well. And of course, this is the problem. You talk about the Bilderbergers. They're clueless. They know nothing about this. It's like, oh, we don't listen to defectors. We don't read Soviet strategic literature.
Yeah, I mean, we see that see this multi-generational collaboration between Russia and China, and it goes much deeper than people are aware of usually. Even the so-called experts, it's a highly sophisticated plan that's been going on for a very long time. So they got their ducks in a row. But in the West, it's like sort of this clutter of countries and this flurry of weirdos and politics and these bureaucrats. And in the middle of this, in the West, we have these Bilderberg-like groups. They're presented now in public as sort of a competent bunch to protect us. But if we look into it, it's just a lot of chaos, and there's a lot of disunity in the West. Now, here's a recent example of this. Britain's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he selected a new ambassador, a new British ambassador for the United States. And the man he selected is Baron Peter Mandelson. Now, Brits know about this guy. He's one of the most scandalous people ever in British politics. As a teenager, he joined the Young Communist League. The Young Communist League, because America was busy in Vietnam pushing back against communism. That was his reason to join the communists, because apparently for him they're the good guys. And for various reasons, he was allowed to join St. Catherine's College in Oxford. And of course, these British universities are a whole nother topic for another day. And in the late 1970s, he ultimately became Lord Mandelson. Mandelson became the head of the British Youth Council. And so in that role, he was traveling in 1978 to Havana, Cuba, for a world festival for the youth organized by the Soviet Union. He actually traveled there.
The World Festival of Youth and Students every so many years meets. And by the way, they met in Moscow on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Not in Moscow, sorry, in Sochi, Russia. And the key speaker was Vladimir Putin, who said, we believe in you. You are the future. We are behind you. To the International Festival of Youth and Students, this big communist organization. Vladimir Putin, supposedly a Christian, supposedly a post-Soviet guy, is publicly saying he's behind the communist youth.
Yeah, and this was not just I was young and dumb. I regret my past. Everybody, please forget about this. This kept on. This was an ongoing thing. In October of 2008, we had reports that Mandelson had a special communications channel, a special relationship with the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Right. So they were meeting all the time, apparently, on a yacht in Greece, of all places. Then in April of 2014, reports said that Mandelson had close ties to the Russian conglomerate called Sistema. 2019, British television channel 4. They broadcast an episode of a show called Dispatches. And they talked about a source or somebody with knowledge about this whole Jeffrey Epstein scandal. You know, this well-connected Jeffrey Epstein who was just had all these young underage girls brought to him. And the source for this Channel 4 television program, the source said that or claimed that Peter Mandelson, while he was a cabinet minister, Mandelson called Epstein to set up a meeting with Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. Okay, I'll leave it at that. And of course then JP Morgan, they try to figure out what happened, and an internal report from JP Morgan about themselves. This report said that Jeffrey Epstein was close to Prince Andrew, you know, the Duke of York, and Lord Peter Mandelson. And it just goes on and on and on. Now, the Daily Mail recently, and I think we've talked about this on the show, the Daily Mail recently reported something about Keir Starmer, now British Prime Minister. When Starmer was young, specifically when he was 23 years old, he made a trip to the Soviet realm in Czechoslovakia. This was sort of they called it a project camp. And so there were 16 other young people at that camp in communist Czechoslovakia, most of them students, and they were tasked with rebuilding a site commemorating or reminding people of something the Nazis did. So this was sort of like a derelict memorial, and they had to rebuild it of some sort. Of course, this whole camp was surveilled by Czech secret intelligence service, the STB. And now the Daily Mail has the dossier, or has a copy of the dossier. In recent years, we saw some more stuff coming out from old STB files. This is an ongoing process.
Has any of it been published? Has the Daily Mail published any of the dossier? I
think they put it in the story. I haven't looked at it in a while. This was like a few months ago. But this was a fairly recent story.
I do remember seeing it. It wasn't. It was indirectly incriminating, as I remember.
Well, they have
of course, what they do is they say, "Oh, this is so long ago. These people aren't like this anymore." But the problem is, these people, there's no moment where they go, I was a leftist, but I saw the light, and here's how I came to see the light. You know,
Yeah.
even if they produced a book like that, like David Horowitz, you read it and you want to be persuaded, but these
Yeah.
people aren't to persuade us that
Now,
they
of course,
actually change their view.
now of course, if you would ask Keir Starmer, why did you go there? Well, he would probably tell you that this was just his youthful expression of anti-fascism, because the memorial they were rebuilding was about the victims of Nazi retaliation after the assassination of high-ranking or almost SS chief and architect of the Holocaust, Reinhard Heydrich. Now, Reinhard Heydrich was killed by Czech resistance fighters. This was the famous Operation Anthropoid. And so when the Soviets pick something like this as the sales pitch for a work camp, oh, we're going to rebuild this memorial because, Reinhard Heydrich and all that stuff. And Operation Anthropoid, I think these Czech resistance fighters had British help or British contacts.
They were put onto it by the British.
Yeah, so this is how you tie the story together, right? And say, oh, right. Here, you're a Brit, Mr. Starmer.
By the way, just a note, the reason the British wanted to assassinate Heydrich was because he was on to Admiral Canaris feeding information to the British. Admiral Canaris wanted to undermine Hitler. He hated the Nazis. And he was the head of German military intelligence, the Abwehr.
Oops.
At the time, and the British were afraid he was about to be arrested because, and of course it's funny, Heydrich was a protege of Admiral Canaris. He also the Navy, and Canaris had taken him under his wing. So that is how he got the Reich's office and in charge of all the branches of Nazi intelligence outside of the army. So just to...
and the Daily Mail quotes somebody else who was at that camp. The person is called Lisbeth Prem. She was a young police officer working in Denmark for some reason. And she says that Keir Starmer, he was a very nice guy, hard-working guy, fun-loving guy, blah, blah, blah. And she says they were all aware they were under surveillance by communist intelligence, but, and this is a quote, we thought if we, set up connections between all nations, we could possibly prevent another world war. So this is always the last argument that these people can use. We try to create peace, and, it was a statement against anti-fascism. So this is kind of these are the people who are now running things in Britain, and it's now such a dangerous time that we live in. Yet we're supposed to read the press and think, well, Bilderberg's gonna save us. All these bureaucrats are gonna save us. They're gonna get their act together. And there's been another bit of sustained weirdness in all of this, and this has to do with Elon Musk of all people, and this is also connected to Bilderberg, by the way. Now, if people maybe have seen it on American news, Elon Musk has now tried to get into you could call it influence German politics, the German election that's now coming up, now Elon Musk has published a text. There's also an English version out now. I think it's even linked to by Mr. Musk himself on X. And so the German version of this text, it was published by a major newspaper here in Germany, the Welt newspaper, right? So a really big newspaper, mainstream newspaper, published this, even though in this text, Elon Musk is praising the extremely far-right party here, the AfD. And the AfD is extremely pro-Russia and increasingly pro-China. The leading candidate, Ms. Weidel, and apparently in a few days, there's going to be a public talk between Elon Musk and Ms. Weidel from the AfD party. So this was kind of baffling to everyone, right? Why wasn't Elon Musk saying something nice about the mainline conservative party here, the CDU, right? Because they're ahead in the polls, seriously ahead, and the CDU party, with all its problems and the Angela Merkel era and all that, the CDU basically had been set up by the Americans after World War II. And the CDU is tied into this whole transatlantic network. So the natural thing to do would have been to say something nice about the CDU, not the AfD. And it gets better, or worse, should I say. Now, this newspaper that published this, the Welt, that's part of the Springer media empire. It's a really big media company. It's been set up after World War II with the help of Americans under the American occupation. They were allowing selected media publications. And Springer is very much tied into this transatlantic network. Now, for example, Springer is always represented at Bilderberg, and now everybody is saying that this would not have been published without the explicit green light by Mr. Döpfner, the head of Springer. Now, Döpfner himself is a member of Bilderberg, right? He attends almost every year. So what's going on here? Why is this happening? Why is Musk, together with the Springer media conglomerate, why have they been advertising with this piece, advertising for the AfD and not the CDU? Very bizarre episode. And this text that Musk published, this text was very generic, and people say it's probably been written by a chatbot, by an AI. So somebody put in some basic sentences, and the chatbot wrote the whole piece. Yeah, very, very strange. Very, very strange episode. And it talks about, Germany needs an economic revival. We need less immigration. We need cheap energy, blah, 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 innovation in the future. So it's a very generic text. Why did he do this? I mean, does he not understand what the AfD is? And he even said that, the leading politician of the AfD right now is a woman who's a lesbian, by the way, Miss Weidel. And she spent years in China, by the way. So how can...
Hold on. The leader, hold on. We can't let that go by.
I know.
Wait a minute. The leader of the AfD party is a lesbian woman who spent time in China?
Yeah, it gets better. She has a partner. She lives most of the time in Switzerland, not Germany, and she has a partner who I think is dark-skinned, even. And so this is kind of
a partner who's not German.
No, not traditionally German or white, shall we say, right? So this is the person that the party has selected to represent the party,
and somehow represents a more traditional German anti-immigration. You're the head of an anti-immigrant party, and you're a lesbian whose partner is an immigrant or the descendant of immigrants.
Yes, yeah, and she spent years in China because she got like this. She got this gig because she was a hardworking student, and I think the German government signed off of this, or an organization tied to the CDU party, the mainline conservative party. They actually helped her go to China, spend some time there and write her master thesis or PhD thesis on, I think it was the Chinese retirement system, some sort. And so she spent time over there, and she's been advocating for better ties with China, as have other important people in the AfD party. Yes, you heard me correctly, Communist China, more ties with Communist China. Why?
So the AfD party not only is pro-Russia, but it's pro-China as well.
Yes.
Oh
yes.
My gosh.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's developed here. This is so strange.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it the sign that the people who vote AfD have lost their instinct? Well, they're supposedly the party of instinct?
Well, there's always a stupid excuse. There's always a stupid explanation. It usually boils down to the core of the traditional conspiracy mythology, and we've talked about this in previous episodes. If people haven't seen it, it's like when you, especially the Russians, when they amplify traditional conspiracy mythology, the elders of Zion taking over Britain and America and blah, blah, blah. The Russians will amplify this because it creates the impression that Western leadership is the worst in the world and anything else is better. Even the communist Chinese are better, even Putin is better, everybody is better but them, right? Even the Iranian government must be tolerated, or anybody must be tolerated, because we have to fight this, fight the elders of Zion, essentially.
Right.
So this is kind of how you can sell it. And of course, when we get closer to another world war or a global conflict, it's this old argument of only Western elites want war. Western elites are crazy. They want this war, and
they're warmongers.
Yeah, and so they force it upon everybody. So you have to join the resistance, which is of course led by Russia and China. So I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, Elon Musk is really hard to read. I mentioned this before. He's a smart guy, and he will say things if he thinks it's strategic to say them at a specific time. Now we've now seen kind of friction with the MAGA movement or parts of the MAGA movement and Elon, because some elements of MAGA they've drifted into this extreme white power ideology, and now it's a question of these, what is it called, the H-1B visa. Can we get qualified people to come to America? And so there's now political friction over controlled migration, right? Controlled skilled migration. Why should people hate each other and attack each other in public like we see now? People attacking Elon now, saying he just bought his way into MAGA 5 minutes ago. He's betraying everybody.
Now let me ask you a question about Elon Musk. Something to note. Musk. Could it be that Musk's saying nice things about the AfD is an attempt to woo that party to a pro-MAGA, pro-Trump thing, to woo them away from China and away from Russia, because now America is led by Trump, and now you need to go with America? Could that be what Musk is doing?
That could very well be what Musk is doing, because the AfD had been riding the Trump wave ever since it really started in 2015, 2016. They've been riding that wave, and also the voters had been the voters had been happy about the first Trump administration. They were happy about a second Trump administration, and the party, the AfD party, is nothing without its supporters and voters, and so I think you may be on to something. That may be what Musk is doing, trying to get the base of the AfD or the voters of the AfD to make them more pro America, because ultimately these voters have to decide: do you like Putin more or do you like Trump more? You like this weirdo over there?
This is the vulnerability of Putin's strategy. If Putin is trying to win over the European right, the German right, and they've put all this effort into it, and Trump wins the election, comes to power here, danger that Trump is going to look better than Putin to these AfD voters, and they're going to go, yeah, we prefer Trump to Putin. If it comes down to it, we hate Biden, we hate the left. America. America is ruled by MAGA. So this is in the way the Russians and Chinese have played this game. In a way, it can come back against them. And what Elon Musk has done is sort of energize that possibility that it's going to backfire on the Russians. Just a thought. And the reason I say this thought is that when I met Greg Autry, and I got this book from him, his book, he wrote this with Peter Navarro. I want to emphasize, because in my previous discussions, people went back to 2022 to find that Peter had been very critical of Musk. But yet, Greg is Musk, Elon Musk, and Navarro, they're writing this book together about space, about the race to the moon against China. So I think Musk, who is so important to America's satellite defense and communications and future resources to the moon and high-tech stuff, it's just inconceivable that Musk is not somehow part of the American defense regeneration scheme that those who want to regenerate America are a part of. And if they can win the right in Europe, they can just turn the tables on the Russians and the Chinese.
Yeah, and I think there's another thing that points in that direction. Now, I've been following this for quite a while, and it really ties into what you just said. Now, even 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and even before that, there was a new drive by the Russians to lure in people to Russia, to say to Americans or to Europeans, come to Mother Russia, because it's this Christian conservative wonderland and there's all these opportunities here. So you can apply for a visa, stay for 3 years, and then we might give you citizenship. And then, of course, we control you, but, that's another story. So it's been going on for a while, but now there's a whole new level to this, because recently the Russians have, as they usually do, the Russians have lowered their standards. So now you can apply to move to Russia, bring your whole family to Russia, even if you don't speak any Russian, even if you're incapable of learning the language, even when you don't know anything about Russian history. All you have to present is the right ideology and, of course, obedience to Putin, the dictator. That's enough. So there's a whole flurry of online influencers, especially Germany, but also America. And this flurry of influencers, they're telling people how to get connected, how to get the ball rolling, to migrate to Russia. And they talk about people who already did that. And then you can listen to them speaking how great it is and, how happy they are living in Russia. It's become quite a huge thing. But if you look at the actual numbers or the estimates, not a whole lot of people actually use that opportunity. Right? I mean, it's never been that easy, apparently, to get a Russian visa or even Russian citizenship. If you're German, for example, right? It's easier than ever. And all these online activists, they believe anyway that Russia is the greatest place on earth. So why are they not moving there? They're not. So with the new Trump administration, and also with Elon Musk on board, sort of, and running X, it looks a lot more attractive, doesn't it? Right? I mean, to think of American conservatives, they can own guns, they have a lot of freedom, and there's more wealth in America, and everything is cooler in America, and Elon Musk is certainly a lot cooler than Alexander Dugin. So America seems a lot cooler, don't you think, than Russia does right now?
Absolutely. And that's the thing, that the Russians and the Chinese, with their elaborate stress and their economic failure that is always they sort of end up hoisted by their own petard, as we say in English. They end up, having these things backfire. They're so brilliant, they should succeed, and sometimes they do. Look at all the countries they've taken over. Look at the advantage they have. So, not to be hopeless about it, I think it's an erasure, because that the West is going to be very vulnerable to Russia and China for the next 4 to 6 years. If Trump can get the whole situation to turn around, then in that case, critical situation where in 2029, especially that year, the Russians and China be tempted to use their strategic advantage or to deploy it in the future if they can stay ahead. And when they see themselves losing their advantages, depending on correlation of forces, it could be any time in the 2030s that we have this war. I mean, it could break out this year. People are very worried about it. But I've been saying I don't think the war is coming now, because they would have already done it in fall. I think they're behind. They're having problems. They're trying to fix them. The war in Ukraine is a problem. Manipulate the right. If things go bad for them politically in Germany or other places, they'll fall back on other strategies because they have so many agents. They have so many cards to play in their hand. Very powerful cards. Like you say, the Bilderberg Group. How many big shots in the Bilderberg Group are cards in the Russian deck? How many people in the MAGA are cards in the deck? How many people in Latin America? How many cards in the deck? And in the Middle East. So there's a lot of play left here, political play, before you go to rockets. The rockets are the final stage when you know, okay, this is the best moment. We know this is the right moment. Now we start the rocket war. Now we progress to World War III. I think that's in the future. And this is what, when I was in Toronto, and again, I've said this again and again, and I met the recent commanders of NORAD, General Glenn Van Herk and his deputy, General Peltier, and others, General Clancy. They were worried about 4 years down the road. We were going to be weaker then than we are now. Why would the Russians and Chinese start a war now? And they've got all these cards in their deck, I would say, politically. The one argument for them going now is the great economic Russia and China. But they're going to try, and this is my big concern, if the Russians suddenly switch their strategy around and they say, all right, we're going to negotiate. This is what Victor Rudd said the other day on our podcast about Conservatives for You. Putin wants Trump alone in the room so that he could get money from the United States. He could get a respite from the sanctions so that the oil and the gas can flow out of Russia again to Europe. This is the danger.
Yeah,
the danger of a sudden turn where the Russians are suddenly the nice Russians again.
Well, the Russians may throw a curveball and get rid of Putin, sort of make it look like it's a new era and whatever. Yeah, but I mean, it's like this when you're a German guy and you go to America, right? Especially the South countryside, and you say, "Hey, I'm from Germany. I'm a German guy, or I'm a German conservative," right? So people will be more friendly to you in America if you come from Germany. But if you're a German and you go to Russia, right? This is a whole nother ball game because you look different, and the Russians have been told to actually hate Germans or the white devils. We're the Nazis. We're the troublemakers. We're all the bad guys. That's us, right? Going back to the old legacy or legend of what was the guy who fought the Swedish and the Germans? Alexander Nevsky. There's a famous Russian movie about him where he
They
fights.
made that movie just before World War II. Stalin
Yeah,
had that movie commissioned
when they
by
fight the
Eisenstein, the
when
great
they
Soviet film producer.
yeah,
Yes.
when they fight the German devils, and it looks like the Germans. They look like the Empire in Star Wars. They're all in their white robes
Got
and
these
blonde hair.
giant metal helmets that
Yeah,
make them look inhuman or demonic.
exactly.
Yes.
So
The
this is
film is a classic.
yeah, and so it's like it's been going on for a while. These Germans or German-looking people, they're always the bad guy, and then of course the Nazi era, and then the Anglo era. The Anglos to the Russians are just another form of the Germans, the German devils, right? These pale-skinned people, blue eyes sometimes or green eyes, and they hate them. So it's a whole different ballgame if you actually go to Russia or you go to America. It's all the difference in the world. And this has been, this difference, this just polar opposite of worlds, that had to be managed in the Soviet era, if people actually remember that. Now, you couldn't just watch Western broadcasts. You couldn't just get Western art. This was illegal. Some people smuggled it or got caught some broadcasts in East Germany, but in general, you were not allowed to expose yourself to Western or especially Anglo culture. This was the class enemy, right? Because when people watched these bootlegs or in later stages they saw some American shows, they were wondering why does everybody in these American television shows seem so rich? They have fridges and televisions and cool cars and nice homes. That looks cooler than what we have. And they seem more cool and relaxed than Russians. So if anybody actually goes over there and gets a Russian citizenship and renounces his former, for example, German citizenship, that's a nightmare. You're not getting out. You're not getting out again. Especially not to tell your story.
The average Russian only makes a few $100s a month, and has to spend half of it on food, which is
or
not
bribes.
particularly helpful.
Or bribes.
Yeah.
You can't even make a longer drive without paying bribes to these roadside cops. And you want your kid to go to a halfway decent kindergarten or school, you have to pay a bribe. This, that, and the other. Mandatory military training, well, you can get your kid out of that if you pay a bribe. So it's always bribe, bribe, bribe. And God forbid you ever piss off any powerful Russian, then you have zero chance in court. You have zero chance of any justice at all, because that's the system. And everybody knows you're not a Russian. Everybody can look at you and listen to you speak, even if you try to speak Russian. They know you're not a Russian. You're just a foreigner. And guess what happened in the Soviet era? If you had foreign relatives, if you had any foreign contacts, you were not even a second class citizen. You were a fifth class citizen. You were either going to the gulag straight away, or you were almost a gulag inmate, or just a short step away from the gulag anyway, right? This is kind of what's going on. And people say, well, Elon Musk has no filter. He says what he feels like. No, I think it's very calculated. Same with Trump. People thought Trump had no filter. He was just talking. But every now and then, Trump would actually admit he says some things that sound outrageous. He wants to pull out of NATO and screw NATO. But then he says, well, I only said that so the Europeans would get their act together, which they partially did now.
Which Rutte recently admitted in December that got NATO to spend more money, the European NATO countries to spend more money on defense.
Yeah.
So Trump was right, right? So that's very interesting. Well, we're near the end of our time. This has been pretty good discussion. I think we've kind of covered a lot of the areas now. Do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I would suggest for people to be cautious with emotions and be cautious with overly quick assessments, because now, we see people attacking Musk. Musk is attacking other people on X, and everybody's always just so angry. Everybody always just accuses everybody else of treason, of being with the enemy or not being brave enough, and blah 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 blah. But I would say, at least in 99% of all cases, this is not constructive at all. It's very destructive, and I warned about this right after the election when Trump won. I said, watch, the left is going to try to antagonize the different blocks in the conservative or right-wing sphere. Try to get everybody to fight with everybody, to weaken the right wing, so the left has a fighting chance in future elections. So it's I know that influencers do this all the time. Sometimes you watch a show like this, there's actual experts, and they can say, okay, here we have a really suspicious case, a really suspicious person. Let's deal with this case. But for the most part, what you hear from influencers, it's just amateurish, it's emotional, and people tend to copy that in their personal sphere. They emulate what they saw on the internet, and they say, oh, this guy is annoying me, or this guy isn't agreeing with me fully, so he must be with the bad guys, he must be a traitor to the cause, and whatever. People are way too fast with this, and I suggest that people take a different approach.
Well, that's good advice. I really like that, Alex, because it's very hard to read a lot of this. There's so much we don't know. We're learning as we go along. It is a wilderness of mirrors, and suspending judgment, not taking sides right away, not getting involved in a battle that might be just a trick to get us to divide and become at odds with each other. We need to be very cautious in our conclusions. So with that, we have kind of, at the beginning, this is our first broadcast of 2025. I think we've had a pretty comprehensive look at the situation of NATO, the situation of Western capitalists, the situation of Russia and China in strategic context. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope you're going to join us next week when we do this again.